So in this video today, we are going to be talking about whether or not I see Carnival Cruise Line stock as a buy right now, trading at around $15 per share. Now, Carnival Cruise Line stock has been a very nasty ride for many investors who have bought this stock pretty much any time in the last 5 years. Over the last couple of weeks, Carnival Cruise Line stock has shown us a number of false bottoms where essentially people think the stock has bottomed out, they buy in, and then the stock continues to fall further, also known as a falling knife. And Carnival Cruise Line stock has been a classic falling knife. And essentially what happened is there would be some bad news that came out, the stock would drop, and then there would be more bad news and the stock would drop again. And then out of nowhere, we had a rally take place with Carnival Cruise Line stock, which ended up being a sucker rally. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second here. So essentially, you have a lot of people that have been watching this stock, waiting for the bottom. They saw the last sucker rally take place, and they're wondering, is this the bottom? Is it going to go lower? Is it going to go up from here? And while there is no way to tell what is going to happen with this stock in the short term, I'm going to give you my opinion on what I think about Carnival Cruise Line as a long-term investment. And I will also be letting you know whether or not this is a stock I plan on buying now or in the future, or maybe not at all. And lastly, guys, before I get into the video, I just have to say that I am not a financial advisor. This is not any kind of financial advice. This is just my opinion, and you should always do your own due diligence before investing in anything out there. Alright, so first of all, what I want to do here is a quick recap on what has happened with Carnival Cruise Line stock so far this year. Going into 2020, they started out pretty good here. The economy was flourishing, people were spending money and traveling frequently, and cruise ships were doing pretty well as a result. People had extra spending money, and it was expected to be a really big year for travel and cruise lines. Carnival Cruise Line shareholders were being rewarded with a dividend of 50 cents per share, which was a yield of around 5%. So this appeared to be an attractive dividend stock. And as far as their balance sheet goes and their credit worthiness, they were considered to be a relatively sound investment opportunity. Now, as far as the actual stock goes, over the last 5 years, the stock has traded at a high of around $72 per share, which was back in early 2018, and the stock had definitely cooled off from those levels. Going into 2020, they were trading at around $45 per share. But then we know what happened here. We had this global pandemic essentially shut down the entire travel industry, and this was essentially the worst possible thing that could ever happen to Carnival Cruise Line, and something they never prepared for. And as I mentioned earlier, we did see a number of false bottoms with this stock, and that is because just like with the airline industry, the bad news came out in waves, which essentially gave us this stair-step decline where the stock dropped massively, traded laterally for a little bit, and then it had another drop. And essentially, people would see these false bottoms, buy into it, and then wake up and realize, oh my God, I'm down 20, 30, 40, 50% from the price I bought shares at. And that is why so many people are weary of entering this stock at around $15 per share with good reason. So just how bad was this for Carnival Cruise Line? Well, over the last year, the stock went from a 52-week high of $56.04 per share down to a 52-week low of $7.80, which is a decline of 86%. So this is an absolute disaster for this company. And it's not every day that you would see a stock like Carnival Cruise Line dropping almost 90% in a year, unless there is a fear of this company just totally going bankrupt and going out of business. It would have to be such a catastrophe to have this type of move taking place with a company. But now things are just getting even more bizarre, because if we look at the stock here, from the 52-week low, the stock is up around 90% already. So if you bought shares around $7 to $8 per share, you've almost doubled your money in no time at all. And again, as I mentioned, we have already seen a sucker rally taking place with this stock back on March 18th to March 26th, we saw the stock again climb around 90% before crashing to a new low. And this is something you have to be very careful of when entering a stock that has fallen massively, is you can get this false run here when investors buy into the stock. You'll get a quick bump, and then you will have bears exit their positions. It's pretty much your last chance to get out. Some people will refer to that as that. But that is what happens. You have a false rally, and then it goes back to a new low. So we know now what has happened with Carnival Cruise Line stock. We have a general idea that it has to do with this pandemic. But what I want to talk about now is why Carnival Cruise Line stock dropped 86% from the 52-week high to the 52-week low. And essentially, it is due to this global pandemic, which is an anomaly. It is something that nobody ever prepared for. Nobody knew it was coming unless you're Bill Gates or, somebody who's really smart like that. The majority of people never expected anything like this to happen, but pretty much every 50 to 100 years, this is something that happens. We have a global pandemic that literally shuts down the entire economy. But that being said, since nobody saw this coming, nobody ever forecasted this into their business models. So for example, when Carnival Cruise Line was doing their forecasting for their best case scenario and their worst case scenario, they never ever considered the number 0 in their forecasting. For them, the worst case scenario was a decline of double digits in travel over a given year. It was never dropping to 0 passengers and basically 0 revenue because nobody ever plans for this type of event. So instead of planning for the number 0, Carnival Cruise Line and other cruise lines most likely only planned for what their numbers would look like in the peak of a recession. And just for example here, in 2009, according to Statista, there were 17.8 million cruise passengers worldwide, which was pretty much during the peak of the Great Recession. And compared to 2019, 10 years later, during a prosperous economy, there were 30 million cruise passengers worldwide. So if you compare a prosperous year where people are traveling to the peak of a recession in 2009, cruise traffic was down about 40%. Now, I don't know what their models look like, but I would guess that Carnival Cruise Line and other cruise lines, when they were doing their forecasting, planned for a worst case scenario of maybe a 50% decline in passengers. So essentially, when Carnival Cruise Line was taking on more debt or investing money in new ships or remodeling old ships, all of their modeling and all of their forecasting was based on a worst case scenario of a drop of 40 to 50% in passenger traffic, in my opinion. That may not be the truth, but just based on the numbers here. So essentially, they just had to make sure they could cover their expenses with 50 to 60% of their current revenue based on a potential drop in traffic. They never ever considered what would happen if there were 0 passengers for a given period of time, because this is something that you never plan for. So pretty much they never planned for the number 0, but that is exactly what we have here. We have a global shutdown of cruise lines, nobody is allowed to sail, and they essentially have no revenue coming in, and their expenses remain at around $1 billion per month, and it's essentially just a cash burn. Now, in a second here, we're going to talk about the financing situation. Carnival Cruise Line was able to get a hold of some good financing that should allow them to stay afloat through 2020, but beyond that, it is largely uncertain. So as mentioned earlier, Carnival Cruise Line is burning through about $1 billion per month by paying down their debts and paying for all of their business-related expenses. And based on no cruise traffic, they essentially have no revenue coming in at this point in time. The main problem here for me with the cruise line industry is that this is not a bailout-friendly industry, so it is very unlikely that the US government would ever bail them out, for the following reasons. First of all, the main one here is that cruise ships are often headquartered in the US but registered in foreign countries for a number of different reasons. First of all, it allows them to pay less money in taxes. Second of all, there is less regulation involved. And third of all, this allows them to have the majority of their staff as non-US citizens. And that is because if a cruise ship is registered in the United States, at least 75% of onboard personnel must be US citizens, which are significantly more expensive to employ. So by registering their cruise ships in different countries, they can avoid taxes, they can hire non-US labor at a cheaper rate, and this also allows them to avoid strict regulations. So there's really not much of a financial incentive here for the United States. They don't get very much tax revenue from them. It's not a big employer of US citizens, so what incentive is there for them to bail out this company? Now, in the case of Carnival Cruise Line, we know they are headquartered in Miami, Florida, but numerous ships actually fly under the Panama flag and are registered in this country. And according to a 2015 report from the Cruise Lines International Association, it said that 90% of cruise line commercial vessels that are taking passengers from US ports fly a flag other than the American flag. So 90% of them, as far as 2015, are not registered to the US for this tax dodge as well as this employment and basically regulation loophole. So this is just revenue that the US is not seeing in terms of taxes, and it's not providing much employment opportunity for US citizens. So we know that the cruise lines are not receiving a direct bailout from the US government, and it's very unlikely in the future. However, Carnival Cruise Line did benefit indirectly from a different type of bailout that the government is doing, and I did a full video on this about a week ago talking about why the stock market is rigged right now. I'll put that video up in the corner if you guys want to check it out at the end. But essentially, the US government has begun purchasing corporate debt for the first time ever in the form of corporate junk bonds. And essentially, a company like Carnival Cruise Lines has benefited from this purchasing of junk bonds because this is their way to raise capital at a time like this. So essentially, Carnival Cruise Line ended up issuing $4 billion in bonds at an interest rate of 11.5% due in 2023. Now, 11.5% is still a very high interest rate, but compared to what they would have received from a private investor, that's still a pretty decent rate. So essentially, rather than private investors buying up these bonds, the main entity purchasing these bonds is the US government. Now, they do have to pay these bonds back, but they are essentially able to get borrowing and financing at a more appealing rate that will allow them to stay afloat. So Carnival Cruise Line and other companies like Ford and some of these other fallen angels they're called have benefited from this corporate debt purchasing from the federal government, and based on these bonds as well as tapping their lines of credit, there's essentially not a huge threat of bankruptcy for Carnival Cruise Line in the year 2020. However, depending on how long this lasts, and how quickly they are able to resume full capacity, that is a totally different question. All right, so next, let's talk about the likelihood of people beginning to travel again as soon as the pandemic ends. So here's my opinion on this. Right now, Americans, for the most part, have all received or are going to receive a stimulus check, and we know that a lot of people are on unemployment. However, we also know that about 50% of Americans on unemployment are currently making more money than they were making employed. You also have this situation where businesses are closed. There's really nowhere to spend money except for online shopping. So I think that when the world opens back up, everyone is going to have money burning a hole in their pocket. They're going to be stir crazy from being inside their homes for so long, and they are going to want to travel. So I do feel that travel will resume as quickly as it is allowed to once the pandemic ends. But that being said, will people be willing to board cruise ships again? That is largely unknown. And just to cover the current situation with the cruise lines, right now all cruise ships are under a no sail order from the CDC, and it has been extended until at least July 24th, and that will likely be extended again unless there is significant improvement and a overall decrease in cases, and we are resuming businesses, and we see that, cases are not skyrocketing and we're not seeing a second wave. Cruise lines, in my opinion, are going to be one of the last things that they open based on this horrible crisis involving some cruise ships that were early hotspots for this virus. And lastly, the third point I want to make here is based on capacity of the cruise ship, because my concern here is that the way of doing things is pretty much going to change forever based on this global pandemic. Will we ever see concert venues at 100% occupancy? Will bars be forced to have 50% occupancy, 75%? There's a lot of unknowns, and especially in crowded places like a cruise ship. So my concern here is that, first of all, when cruise ships open back up, it's a pretty safe bet, in my opinion, they will not be allowed to operate at 100% capacity. Maybe every other room is going to be empty or something like that. But I highly doubt they're going to pack cruise ships to full capacity based on what happened in the past with the cruise ships being a hotbed for this virus. And essentially, let's say cruise ships are operating at 50% capacity. That essentially means they are making 50% of the revenue that they would have ordinarily been making. Now, there's no saying for sure whether or not this will happen. This is merely my opinion and a speculation on what I think could happen when cruise lines open back up. So to wrap things up here, guys, personally, I am not buying into the cruise line industry. I don't own any of the stocks, and I don't plan to buy them in the future. The main reason behind that is because this is not a bailout-friendly industry, and there are just too many unknowns here for me. Do I expect Carnival Cruise Line to go bankrupt? I don't. I think they'll be okay. They'll be able to secure financing and stay afloat. However, I don't think they're just going to snap back to life here, and I don't think people are just going to dive into cruise traveling out of nowhere, and I certainly don't think they're going to be allowed to operate at 100% capacity, at least right out of the gate. I think the public perception towards cruises is pretty bad right now based on what happened with the Carnival Diamond Princess, where there were essentially 700 cases of the virus on board and everyone had to quarantine. We can say for sure those people on that cruise ship will probably never sail again, and they have, I'm sure, told all of their friends and family about the horrors, and so people have a negative perception towards these cruise ships right now, and that will take time to change. The last thing I want to say here is if you are buying shares of Carnival Cruise Line, based on the fact that we have already seen this sucker rally take place, I would not recommend lump sum investing. If you are purchasing shares, I would buy a little bit every single week for a long period of time rather than dumping all of your money in, also known as dollar cost averaging. If you dump all of your money in, it's a total gamble. Nobody knows where that stock is going to go in the short term. So anyways, guys, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. And lastly, if you are looking to get 2 completely free stocks, Webull is currently running a promotion where if you open up a brokerage account, you're going to get 1 free stock just for signing up for the account. Then, if you fund the account with $100 or more on your initial deposit, you're going to get a second completely free stock. So if you guys want to grab 2 free stocks, that's the top link in the description below. I am affiliated with Webull, so I may earn a commission in the process. But thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next video.